Hey everyone, thanks for coming to our YouTube channel and checking out Reunion. Reunion's mission is helping people find their way back to God. And our prayer for you is that you'd encounter God and you'd be filled with more hope by being with us. And today we're continuing our series called First Things First. Life moves so fast that we can easily lose sight of what really matters. And in this series, we're looking at what we should actually be prioritizing this year, what is actually important for our flourishing. Before we get to Nathan as he shares about first fruits and how generosity actually frees us, let me share about how you can get connected with Reunion. If you're in the Boston area and you're looking for a community to explore faith with, or you're just curious about God, we invite you to participate with us in Somerville and Davis Square. We'd love to meet you and join our community as we do this life thing together. You can find all the details on our website, reunionboston.com. If you have your phone handy, also feel free to scan the QR code using your camera and it'll take you directly to our connection card. Fill out the card and we'll reach out to answer any questions you might have about faith or how you can be a part of our community. You can also follow us on social media. We're on Facebook and Instagram. Now here's Nathan as he shares with us.
Hey everyone, my name is Nathan and I am looking forward to spending some time with all of you today. Earlier this week, I came across a blog that was published by the University of Portland, and I found it honestly very fascinating. And I should say kind of up front, it wasn't really a blog. I don't think blog is the right term. It was an article that they wrote as part of their welcome page for the university's international students. So the article was written with the intent of helping these international students better understand and engage with American culture. And the article does its best to describe what they view as the values and priorities of most Americans in today's society, and then give kind of a brief explanation about why Americans find those things to be so important. And I found the list to, like I said, be really fascinating. I think at first I was kind of taken aback by it, almost like it surprised me, but when I really think about it, it probably shouldn't have. The list had, I think, 12 different things on it. And of those things, there were 6 that really stuck out to me. And they were individualism, achievement, action, work, materialism, and time. And I sat back and, I kind of read this list and just thought about it. And I was like, is this really what we care about? Are these really the highest values in our country? The things that matter most to so many of us? I mean, when we look at our own lives, are these the things that we value too? Maybe for some of us, it is our work. We put so much pressure on ourselves to work hard and to climb the corporate ladder. We're just thinking about the next job or the next promotion. And that doesn't fully surprise me. I mean, we've been taught from such a young age that we need to focus on work. So we end up working more and doing more. Also, we can get that promotion so it'll pay a little bit more, but then that requires us to work more so we can think about the next promotion. We've gotten caught in the cycle of never doing enough so we can never have enough. And when we never have enough, we can never be enough. Maybe it's not work. Maybe it's materialism. Maybe it's things. Maybe it's desire to have more. Maybe we've told ourselves that once we finally get that certain thing that we have been craving for so long, then we will finally be happy. And yet we can find story after story of people that have driven themselves so far into debt, all because they were thinking that buying the right thing would finally give them the life that they were longing for, finally help them find joy. But it didn't. So they had to buy the next thing. Maybe it's time. I mean, time is such a valuable commodity. Seems like we never have enough of it. I mean, truly, I get it. We have work or school, and then we have to go home and we have things with our family. We have chores to do. We got to clean. We got to take care of the house. We have errands to run, bills to pay, church or community group to show up to. Time is something that it seems we never have enough of it. And once we finally get a little bit more, we find a way to fill that gap up. As I begin to unpack it, I think I understand why these things show up on this list. It's not a stretch to see that these really are some of the top values and priorities in our culture today. And if that is true, what I think we need to do is ask ourselves a question today. By getting more of these things, by doing more of these things, are we really any better off? Does having more time or more money or more things really help us live the life of thriving that so many of us crave? Because the data points out over and over again that the answer to that seems to be no, not really. While I was looking into all of this, I found this website called Investopedia. And they wrote this article. And in the article, they pointed out something that I think really speaks to the way this scarcity mindset, or this mindset of having more and keeping more and wanting more for ourselves, the way it really shapes our souls. See, in the report, they looked at some different metrics and they interviewed some different people and came to what I would say was a shocking conclusion about the state of finances right now. They found that Americans are actually in a better financial state than many of us have been in a long time. Even taking into account things like inflation over the past few years, they found that Americans right now have more of what they called spending money, or money that you can use on non-essential things, than the average American did 5 years ago. However, at the same time, they found this: the amount of Americans who viewed themselves as being worse off financially over that same period also grew by over 15%. Meaning many of us are in a better financial position than we were before the pandemic, but we feel worse about it. We're actually feeling worse about our money. Many of us have adopted, have believed, have bought into the scarcity mindset when it comes to money. We might have more of it in reality, but we are significantly more stressed and anxious about it. And even though we have more of it, we keep telling ourselves that we do not have enough and that we need more in order to finally be happy. However, what's really interesting is that the opposite is actually true. The more generous we are with our finances, it actually leads to greater levels of happiness. In a study that was published by Nature Communications, researchers found that the University of Zurich, which is in Switzerland, told 50 people that they'd be receiving about $100 over a few weeks. And half of the people were asked to commit to spending that money on themselves, completely on themselves. And the other half were asked to spend it on someone that they knew. And this is what they found: that those who had agreed to spend money on other people tended to make more generous decisions throughout the experiment compared to those who had agreed to spend on themselves. They also had more interactions between the parts of their brain associated with altruism and happiness, and they reported higher levels of happiness after the experiment was over. Another study published in the Journal of Happiness Studies found researchers who examined data from nearly 70,000 participants in the UK. And those 70,000 participants received surveys about their volunteering habits and their mental health, including their distress and functioning in everyday life. And they received these surveys every 2 years from 1996 to 2014. And compared to people who didn't volunteer, people who had volunteered in the past year were more satisfied with their lives and rated their overall health as better. What if everything we thought we knew about having more has actually been a lie? See, today we're finishing up the series that we've been in called First Things First. We've spent the last few weeks asking questions about what matters most, what is worthy of our time this year. If we want to discover what a life of flourishing truly looks like, and we want to live into that way of life more deeply, what should we invest in? What should we prioritize? What are the things that Jesus and Scripture is calling us to? And this morning, as we close out our series, we're going to look at what the Bible has to say about giving. And I'm sure for some of us, just hearing me say that like makes your blood pressure rise, your anxiety begins to rise. Maybe you've seen churches talk about money in ways that are really unhealthy and honestly really unhelpful. Maybe you felt some sense of guilt or shame about money, and a person that you trusted or an institution that you trusted tried to play into those emotions, tried to play into that guilt to convince you to give more. And I want you to know, I don't think guilt or obligation is what God had in mind when he first established the concept of tithing or giving or generosity all the way back with his people in the Old Testament. If you were with us last week, we talked really briefly about the story of the Israelite people that is found in the book of Exodus. And just to catch everyone up, in the early parts of the book, the nation, they found themselves as slaves in the land of Egypt. And for the longest time, they had nothing of their own. They were considered nothing more than property by the Egyptians in the lands. And I think that we all can understand that this must have been an absolutely horrific experience for this group of people. And in their desperation, they cried out to God to send someone to free them and deliver them. And God hears them. He sends a man named Moses. And after a lot of crazy and miraculous events, we found ourselves last week at the point in the story where the Israelites were at the foot of Mount Sinai and they built a golden calf to worship. And Moses, who was on top of the mountain talking with God, had to plead with God to save the people again. And God hears Moses's pleas and he relents, shows mercy. See, where we're going to find ourselves today is just a short period after that story. Moses and the Israelites have been camped at the mountain for a while now, and they were preparing to leave the mountain and find a place to settle. And this is a turning point in the nation's history. See, generation after generation had lived in a land that was not their own. And this was the first time that this group of people were going to settle in a land with the intention of staying permanently. But also, we need to understand that for the entire story up until this point, that means that this group of people lived on next to nothing. They were slaves who did not own land or possessions of their own. And then they were freed, but they immediately wandered around and lived on next to nothing as they traveled through the deserts. Many times they needed God to provide for their most basic needs. Imagine waking up every day and not knowing where your next meal was going to come from. Imagine not knowing if you were going to be able to find water for the day, if there would be enough resources to go around. The mental toll of wandering in the desert, of the uncertainty of having enough for each and every day. This almost had to lead to a scarcity mindset. When you're always convinced that there is never enough, you're going to tighten your grip on your possessions and your wealth more and more. We need to really consider the effects that this way of life would have had on this group of people. And we even see it play out in their story. Like I said, there were a few different times in the book of Exodus where God had to provide for the people. Basic things, food, water. But then God has to tell them when he does provide not to take more of what he's providing than what they actually need. God has to make sure their scarcity mindset does not get the best of them. But now at this point, as they prepare to leave the mountain, God is forming this group of people into a new community. God knew this group of people had a lot of baggage from the past, and God wanted this community to live differently than everyone else. So as the Israelites, I'm sure, are struggling, telling themselves things like, I have to make sure I have enough. I have to look out for me and my family. I won't go back. I will make sure to always keep hunger and thirst and slavery or whatever fear was pressing on their minds. Keep that at bay. As the draw and the allure and the promise of having more lays heavy on their hearts. God is trying to establish something new in them. God is trying to help them be a new type of people. So God gives new laws and regulations to this group of people. But when I say that, think less of rules that must be followed. See, what we know is that the laws God gives his people are actually an invitation to a way of life that is better for the person following them. Laws that lead to safety, lead to thriving. And we find some of the laws that God gives them in our text today, Leviticus 23. And we're going to pick up in verse 9, where we read this. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you enter the land I'm going to give you, and you reap its harvest, bring to the priest a sheaf of the first grain you harvest. He is to wave that sheaf before the Lord, so it will be accepted on your behalf. The priest is to wave it on the day after the Sabbath. On the day you wave the sheaf, you must sacrifice as a burnt offering to the Lord a lamb a year old without defect, together with its grain offering of 2/10 of an ephah of the finest flour mixed with olive oil, a food offering presented to the Lord, a pleasing aroma, and its drink offering of 1/4 of a hin of wine. You must not eat any bread or toast or roasted or new grain, until the very day you bring this offering to your God. This is to be a lasting ordinance for the generations to come wherever you live." See, God gives the Israelites a law demanding that they bring their first fruits to God. In biblical times, when people lived in an agrarian kind of society, harvest time would have been a very significant time because that was the moment that all the hard work the farmers had poured into their crops all year was finally going to pay off. And God called his people to bring the first yield, the first fruits from their harvest to him as an offering. And it's kind of interesting. God goes like a bit Gordon Ramsay here. He is very specific about what he is asking for. But I think what we should note is that this is a really expensive and significant offering. See, a sheaf of grain would have been about 2 liters of grain. 2/10 of an ephah would have been about 8 cups of oil and flour. A hin was about 1 gallon of wine. This is a significant portion of the harvest. We're looking at multiple days worth of food and drink, let alone a lamb on top of that. And these sacrifices were supposed to be made before the rest of the harvest took place, meaning at harvest time, when all the work was about to come to fruition, you had to harvest these sacrifices, gather up all the supplies, and then pause. No more work. And then you would go make the sacrifice, and only then could you go back to your field and finish the harvest. Imagine if you planned a vacation and you saved and you bought the hotel, you fueled up the car, you figured out the best route, and then you finally got everything loaded into the car. But before you left, you had to go and give a portion of your luggage away. 1/10 of your luggage, the best of it had to go and be given away. And only then could you actually leave for the vacation. Imagine if you went to a fancy dinner and you were so excited because you heard this place has great steak or great chicken or great pasta or great burritos or great whatever. But before you could eat any of it, you had to slice a part of that meal off and put it in a to-go box and offer it to someone who worked in a temple or at a church. And only after you'd given it to them, only after you prayed with them, could you go back and enjoy your meal. And I want you to know, if you ever have an inclination to do that, you can email me anytime. We'll talk about it. It'll be great. But what I'm trying to say is that for most of us, when we read this, we automatically think God is just wanting our best because he deserves it. And there is part of that that is true. What if there was more to this command than just finding space for Israel to be reverent to God? What if this was actually a way to continue to free Israel? See, a scarcity mindset, it's really just a new kind of slavery. Whatever you feel like you don't have enough of, it actually enslaves you. You do everything you can to hold on to what you have and everything you can to try and get more of it. Really interestingly, the actor Will Smith, maybe you've heard of him, before he did something absolutely horrible, I should say, wrote a biography where he shared actually some pretty fascinating insights. He gets at this idea of becoming a slave to keeping what he has when he wrote this: becoming famous is amazing. Being famous is a mixed bag. Losing any amount of fame is miserable. See, once Will Smith got what he wanted, it was miserable trying to keep it. He was no longer free because he became enslaved to the need to stay free. For the Israelites, and I would guess for many of us, we often get this idea that having more will give us what we are looking for. Maybe it's happiness or freedom or joy or contentment, or that having more will heal some kind of loneliness or brokenness inside of us. But what if it didn't? What if it just created a deeper longing for something else or something more? What if the more we obtained, the more we stored up, the more we hoarded for ourselves, actually led to a deeper longing for more, because more could never fill what our heart was actually longing for? What if it actually enslaved us? Will Smith transitions this idea to money, and he concludes his thoughts like this. Same with money. I think for a lot of people, the process of becoming wealthier feels better than having wealth. So God calls the Israelites into the opposite of this, into something different. God tells his people to give of their first fruits, the very best of what they produce and the very first of what they produce. But I don't think this was a way for God to demand that Israel pay him back for freeing them. I don't think God is just a selfish God who wants more things. I think this was a way of God helping Israel stay free. I think this was a way in which God was making sure that Israel's hearts weren't wandering and putting their hope in something else. Because putting their hearts and hope and trust in something else to fulfill them was only going to lead them to disappointment, and it was only going to lead them into a new type of slavery. What if generosity was actually to make sure that our hearts stay free? Author and pastor Rich Villodas picked up on this idea when he wrote, generosity, is a formational practice that can help us grow into maturity. Money has a hold on us in devious ways. When we give, we loosen the grip money has on us. Tithing 10% is a way of training our lives to become like our generous Lord and live in greater freedom from attachments. Jesus seemed to pick up on this idea as well. In the New Testament, in what is arguably Jesus's most famous teaching, Jesus speaks on the things that want to capture our hearts. In Matthew 6, after Jesus has talked about giving to the needy, so we don't put our faith in our money, and then he talks about fasting, so we don't put our faith in our comfort, Jesus begins a new verse by talking about where we store our treasures. And Jesus says, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth." It sounds a lot like don't have a scarcity mindset. And his next command is actually how you live out the first. Meaning, if you want to know how to make sure you aren't focusing on storing up treasures here on earth, Instead, invest in things that have a life-giving impact. Give the best of your time and your money and your effort and everything you are to loving others, to bringing about justice, to showing grace and mercy, to easing the pain and the burdens of others, to bringing heaven here to earth. And Jesus doesn't just leave this idea as a nice platitude, but actually gives a reason and meaning behind the command. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. What you give your best to is what ultimately has your heart. Today, Jesus might say something like, where your money goes, where you spend your time, where you wake up, what you wake up thinking about, what gets your best effort, what gets most of your energy, that is where your heart is. As what has your heart. See, giving God our first fruits is a way of shaping our hearts, and it leads to freedom. It leads to thriving. And we talked about studies just a little bit ago that show this. Generosity towards loving others well actually leads to greater benefit for us. It leads to freedom for our lives. It allows us to release our need for control and our need for more. And it opens us up to having God shape and mold our hearts. It leads to a life of joy and thriving. The void in us that we try to fill with a scarcity mindset, God is offering to fill that void instead. If only we would be willing to give of our first fruits instead of what we often do, which is feel like we need to hide and hoard even things like our last fruits. And trust me, I know how counterintuitive this sounds. I know how crazy it might be to hear this. There is something in us that just seems to recoil when we hear that it's actually in giving, not getting, that we find life. It's so countercultural to think that it is in less and not more that we find freedom. Christian Smith and Hilary Davidson talk about this in their book, The Paradox of Generosity, Giving We Receive, Grasping We Lose. In it, they write, generosity is paradoxical. Those who give receive back in turn. By spending ourselves for others' well-being, we enhance our own standing. In letting go of some of what we own, we ourselves move towards flourishing. This is not only a philosophical or religious teaching, it is a sociological fact. In failing to care for others, we do not properly take care of ourselves. And this is, at the heart of it, this is the gift of the gospel. Sacrificing your first fruits from an outside perspective, it can seem insane, but the promise of the gospel is that there is more there. There is a better life offered to us in the way of Jesus. A life that is better than money could buy or that things could promise. From the outside, it might seem like we are missing out, but the gospel shows us that we are actually living a life in abundance. That's why Jesus has this famous saying that goes, for whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. That's the promise of the gospel. And one of my favorite things about this verse is that it isn't a command. It's just a statement of reality. Jesus doesn't say you should lose your life. No, he just says that if you are willing to lose your life, what we realize is that this is the place where we actually find life. If we would just be willing to give our first fruits, if we would just be willing to live generously instead of in scarcity, if we would just be willing to give up instead of demand and drive ourselves to get more, if we would just lose our lives, we just might find our life. It's the countercultural promise of the gospel. What are our first fruits that we have to offer God? What is trying to hold our hearts captive? And in giving them up, God might actually be freeing us. So often when the idea of giving and generosity comes up, our minds first go to money. And I know that there are times, especially living in a place like Boston, where money is tight, expenses seem like they're constantly rising. And I pray you don't hear this as a guilt trip. For some of us, money might actually be the thing that really does have control of our hearts. It might be the thing that always has us worried and anxious. It might be the thing that we feel a scarcity mindset towards. And some of us we need to honestly wrestle with how we can be more generous with our finances and how we can allow God to form our hearts in generous ways when it comes to our money. But I don't think this idea of first fruits is only applied to our money. For some of us, it might be about our time. For some of us, it might be about our gifting. And for some of us, it might be about our comfort. There could be plenty of things in our lives. And when we think about being generous in those ways, we shudder. Maybe this is an invitation for us to step into freedom. Maybe this is our chance to give up our first fruits in those areas. Maybe this is a chance for God to capture our hearts. Maybe this is a chance to experience freedom. Because whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for the sake of the gospel will find it. Thank you guys so much. Let me turn things back over to Matt.
Let's close with our benediction. Go now into the world, inspired by the extravagant love of God. Live generously with open hands, loving one another as if your lives depended on it. Be good stewards of the gifts you have received, so that God may be glorified in all you say and do. And may the abundant love of God surround you. May the extravagant grace of Jesus Christ sustain you. And may the constant presence of the Holy Spirit inspire and encourage you in every good deed and word. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Go in peace and live the church.